I stared at the text message on my phone, reading it for the fourth time in 10 minutes, my coffee growing cold on the kitchen counter. Mom, we need to talk about Dad's gambling. Can't ignore it anymore. Call me. From my daughter Sarah sent at 6:47 this morning, while I was still in bed, probably nursing another sleepless night, worrying about bills, and wondering why Tom had been so secretive about his evening walks lately. The autumn light filtered through my kitchen window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor that Tom and I had installed together 15 years ago when we'd bought this little ranch house on Maple Street. Back then, we'd laughed about growing old together here, about grandchildren visiting for Christmas mornings and summer barbecues. Now I wondered if we'd even make it to Christmas without losing everything. I set the phone down with trembling hands and walked to the living room window, pulling back the sheer curtains to watch Mrs. Henderson across the street watering her mums. The normalcy of her routine, the careful way she adjusted the spray nozzle, the methodical pattern she followed from planter to planter, made my chest tighten with longing for a life where the biggest concern was whether to plant chrysanthemums or pansies for fall. Morning, hon. Tom's voice behind me made me jump. He shuffled into the kitchen in his worn slippers, hair sticking up at odd angles, reaching for the coffee pot, like this was any other Tuesday morning in our 32 years of marriage. Sarah texted, I said without turning around. The silence stretched between us like a canyon. I heard him pour coffee, the clink of the spoon against the mug, the soft sigh he always made before his first sip. All the sounds of a man buying time. What did she say? His voice was careful, controlled. I turned to face him, this man I'd married when I was 22, and thought I knew everything about love and loyalty. His brown eyes, the ones that used to make me feel safe, now reminded me of a cornered animal's. She knows Tom. He sat heavily in his chair at the breakfast table, the one with the slight wobble we'd been meaning to fix for months. Knows what. Don't. I shook my head, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Please don't make me spell it out. I've been covering for you for 6 months, telling myself those casino charges were just occasional entertainment, that the missing money from our savings was for some surprise you were planning. I laughed bitterly. God, I even convinced myself you were having an affair because somehow that felt less devastating than this. Tom's face crumpled like wet paper. Donna, I can explain. Can you can you explain how we went from having 18,000 in savings to owing 3,000 on credit cards? Can you explain why I found those cash advance receipts in your jacket pocket when I was doing laundry last week? The words hung in the air between us like smoke. Outside, Mrs. Henderson had moved on to her roses, deadheading the last blooms of the season with surgical precision. I envied her focus, her ability to tend to something that would bloom again next year with proper care. It started small, Tom said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. After I got laid off from the plant, I felt so useless, like I'd failed you, failed us. Remember how excited you were when I got that severance package? You started talking about maybe taking that cruise we'd always planned about finishing the basement. I remembered. I'd been so proud of how well he was handling the layoff, how positive he seemed about finding new work. At 58, he wasn't exactly a hot commodity in the job market, but his experience in manufacturing had to count for something. The first time I just went to blow off steam. Jimmy Morrison from work invited me to that new casino over in Springfield, said it would be good for me to get out, clear my head. Tom's hands wrapped around his coffee mug like it was a lifeline. I won $200 that first night. 200 Donna, it felt like a sign. A sign of what? The question came out sharper than I intended. That maybe I could contribute something, that maybe I could surprise you, take care of us the way I used to. His voice broke on the last words. I know how stupid that sounds now. I wanted to go to him to smooth his hair the way I had when he'd cried the night they closed the plant where he'd worked for 23 years, but my feet stayed planted on the cold kitchen tile. How much Tom total, including what I borrowed against the house? The words hit me like ice water. You borrowed against the house. He couldn't meet my eyes. 15,000, but it's a second mortgage, not a refinance. The payments are manageable if I find work soon. But 15,000. I sank onto the couch, the familiar cushions offering no comfort. Our house. The house we were going to leave to Sarah and the kids. I was going to tell you once I won it back. I had a system I was tracking patterns. Oh, Tom. The disappointment in my voice seemed to physically wound him. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. My phone buzzed again, another text from Sarah. Mom, I'm coming over. Dad's been calling me asking for money and I can't keep lying to Mark about it. I showed him the message. She's been covering for you too. I never asked her to. Didn't you? When you called her last week asking for that loan for car repairs, when you made her promise not to tell me, because you wanted it to be a surprise when you got the transmission fixed. The guilt on his face was answer enough. I thought about Sarah juggling her own mortgage and 2 kids in college, probably lying awake at night, wondering how to help her father without destroying her marriage. Mark was a good man, but he'd been clear about their financial boundaries when they'd bought their house last year. 20 minutes later, Sarah's Honda pulled into our driveway. Through the window, I watched her sit for a moment, steeling herself for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. At 34, she looked so much like I had at that age, determined, capable, but with worry lines that seemed too deep for someone who should be in the prime of her life. Hi, Mom. She hugged me tightly when I opened the door, and I smelled her familiar lavender shampoo mixed with the vanilla candle she always burned in her car. Dad? Tom had cleaned up while we waited, changed into a button-down shirt, and combed his hair as if looking presentable might somehow make this conversation easier. Sarah, honey, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about some misunderstandings. Dad, stop. Sarah sat down across from him at the table, her purse clutched in her lap like armor. There's no misunderstanding. I know about the gambling. Mom knows about the gambling. And I know you borrowed money against the house because I saw the paperwork when I helped Mom file her insurance claim last month. I looked at her sharply. You knew about the second mortgage. I suspected. The paperwork was mixed in with the homeowner's policy renewal. Sarah's voice was steady, but I could see her hands shaking. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, and I hoped Dad would tell you himself. Tom ran his hands through his hair, leaving it disheveled again. I was trying to protect you both. The stress, the worry, the stress. Sarah's voice rose slightly. Dad, I've been lying to my husband for 3 months. Mom's been skipping her book club meetings because she can't afford the coffee money. You think that's protection? The mention of book club hit me like a physical blow. I told the ladies I was dealing with a family situation, which was true enough, but I missed our Thursday morning gatherings terribly. Missed Margaret's terrible jokes and Linda's thoughtful questions about whatever novel we were dissecting, missed feeling like a person with interests beyond damage control. How did you find out? I asked Sarah. The bank called me. Apparently Dad had listed me as a reference on some loan application. She looked at her father with a mixture of love and exasperation that reminded me painfully of my own feelings. They wanted to verify his employment status. Tom's face went white. I never thought they'd actually call you. What employment status, Dad? You've been unemployed for 8 months. I've been looking. Have you? Sarah pulled a folder from her purse and spread several printed pages across the table. Because I drove by 3 places where you told Mom you had interviews, and 2 of them weren't even hiring. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of someone mowing their lawn, despite the October chill. I stared at the papers Sarah had spread out, printouts from company websites, job posting screenshots, a handwritten timeline of Tom's supposed interviews. You've been investigating your own father, Tom said, his voice hollow. I've been trying to help you, Sarah shot back. Do you have any idea how scared Mom has been? How scared I've been I thought maybe you were sick or depressed or having some kind of breakdown. Gambling addiction honestly didn't occur to me until I saw the casino charges on Mom's bank statement. You showed her our bank statement. Tom looked at me accusingly. I asked to see it, Sarah said before I could respond. When Mom mentioned money was tight, I offered to help with the grocery budget. She showed me the statement to prove they didn't need charity. Her voice softened. That's when I saw the pattern. Cash advances every Tuesday and Friday, casino charges, and then I remembered that you'd started taking those evening walks right around the same time. I thought about those walks, how I'd encouraged them at first. After decades of Tom coming home from the plant exhausted and settling into his recliner for the evening, seeing him want to be active had seemed like a positive change. You weren't walking at all, were you? Sometimes I did walk to the bus stop. He looked older than his 59 years in that moment, the weight of months of deception etched in the lines around his eyes. The casino runs a shuttle from the mall parking lot. Free rides, free drinks while you play. It felt like I was doing something. Something that's put our family at risk, Sarah said. Mom, do you know what the payments are on this second mortgage? I shook my head, afraid to hear the answer. $437 a month for 15 years. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. On top of your existing mortgage, that's almost $1,500 a month in house payments. The number hit me like a physical blow. Our monthly Social Security and my part-time job at the library brought in just under $3,000. After utilities, insurance, groceries, and basic living expenses, we'd been cutting things close even before Tom's gambling. Now we were looking at impossible math. I can get a job, Tom said quickly. Full-time, part-time, whatever it takes. I've been applying. Where Sarah pulled out her phone and started scrolling. Because I've checked with every major employer within 30 miles of here. The closest thing to a match for your experience is a supervisor position at the new distribution center, and they want someone with a college degree. Tom's shoulders sagged. At 59, with only a high school diploma and 23 years of experience at a now-closed manufacturing plant, his options were limited. We both knew it, even if we'd been pretending otherwise. There has to be something, I said as much to convince myself as anyone else. Construction retail security. Mom! Sarah's voice was patient but realistic. Dad's been looking for 8 months. The jobs that are available either don't pay enough to cover the mortgage payments, or they won't hire someone his age even though they can't legally say that's why. I felt the walls of our little house closing in around me. This kitchen where I'd packed countless school lunches, where Tom and I had shared quiet morning coffee for decades, where we'd planned modest dreams and celebrated small victories, it suddenly felt like a trap. What do we do? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Sarah reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. We figure it out, together. But first, Dad has to commit to getting help. Tom looked up sharply. I don't need... Yes, you do. Sarah's voice was firm. This isn't a moral failing, Dad. It's an addiction. And like any addiction, you need professional help to beat it. We can't afford therapy, I said automatically. There are free programs through the state, support groups, and Sarah took a deep breath. Mark and I have been talking. We think you should consider selling the house. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. This house, where we'd raised our daughter, where every room held memories of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and quiet Sunday afternoons, where Tom had taught Sarah to ride her bike in the driveway, and where I'd tended a garden full of roses and tomatoes and hope. Absolutely not, Tom said. I won't have my family homeless because of my mistakes. You wouldn't be homeless, Sarah said patiently. There's a nice senior living community about 10 miles from here. Independent living, not assisted care. One-bedroom apartments, maintenance included community activities. The rent would be about half what you're paying now in total housing costs. I tried to picture it, a small apartment with thin walls and neighbors I didn't know, no garden, no space for Sarah and the kids to visit comfortably. I don't know. At least look at it, Sarah urged, just to see what the options are. My phone rang, making all three of us jump. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but lately that had become ominous rather than just annoying. Mrs. Davidson, this is Janet from First National Bank. I'm calling about your second mortgage payment, which was due 3 days ago. I felt my face burn with embarrassment as I realized Sarah could hear every word in the quiet kitchen. There must be some mistake. I thought the payment wasn't due until the 15th. The payment was due on the 10th, ma'am. This is actually your second missed payment. We've been trying to reach your husband, but the phone number on file seems to be disconnected. Tom's face went ashen. I looked at him questioningly, and he mouthed, I had to cancel the cell phone. Couldn't afford both phones. I see, I said into the phone. Can I call you back in an hour? I need to check my records. Of course, But Mrs. Davidson, I do need to let you know that after 30 days past due, we begin foreclosure proceedings. You have 26 days to bring the account current. The line went dead. I set the phone down with hands that felt disconnected from my body. How much? Sarah asked quietly. $874, plus a late fee. The numbers felt foreign in my mouth like a language I'd never learned to speak. Tom stood abruptly and walked to the kitchen window, his back rigid with shame. I thought I had more time. I thought I could win enough to make the payments current before anyone noticed. Dad, Sarah's voice was infinitely gentle. The casino doesn't care if you win or lose. The house always wins in the end. That's how they make money. I joined Tom at the window, looking out at Mrs. Henderson's perfectly maintained yard. Remember when we used to laugh about her obsession with her lawn? How we'd joke about having nothing better to do when we got old than worry about crabgrass? Tom's reflection in the window looked haunted. I remember. I'd give anything to have crabgrass be my biggest problem right now. He turned to face me, and I saw tears in his eyes. Donna, I'm so sorry. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I never intended for this to happen. I thought I could control it. I know. And I did know. This wasn't the man who'd balanced our checkbook to the penny for 3 decades, who'd never made a major purchase without consulting me first, who'd saved for months to buy me a modest anniversary ring on our 25th. This was addiction wearing my husband's face, and I was finally beginning to understand the difference. Sarah cleared her throat gently. I've made some calls. There's a Gamblers Anonymous meeting tonight at St. Mark's Episcopal about 15 minutes from here. And I found a financial counselor who works with people in crisis. She charges on a sliding scale. You've been planning this conversation for a while, Tom observed. I've been worried about you both for a while, Sarah corrected. I love you, Dad. That's why I can't watch you destroy yourself and take Mom down with you. The afternoon sun was slanting lower through the kitchen window, and I realized we'd been talking for over 2 hours. In that time, our entire future had shifted from uncertain to actively frightening, but somehow I felt clearer than I had in months. The terrible waiting was over. The secrets were out. Now we could actually deal with reality instead of dancing around it. Okay, Tom said suddenly. I'll go to the meeting tonight. Sarah and I both stared at him. Just like that, I asked. What choice do I have? You're right, both of you. I've made a mess of everything, and I can't fix it the same way I broke it. He sat back down at the table, his shoulders squared with what looked like determination. But I want to be clear about something. I don't expect either of you to sacrifice your futures for my mistakes. Dad, no, Sarah, listen to me. If we lose the house, if we have to start over, that's on me. But I won't have you and Mark draining your savings or taking out loans to bail me out. And I won't have your mother living in poverty because she married an idiot. Tom, I reached for his hand across the table. We made vows, for better or worse. This is worse, but it's still us. Is it? His voice was small, uncertain. After everything I've lied about, everything I've hidden, how can you even stand to look at me? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself for weeks as the evidence of his deception had mounted. How did you rebuild trust with someone who'd systematically deceived you about the most basic aspects of your shared life? How did you move forward when the ground beneath your feet had shifted so fundamentally? I don't know, I admitted. Right now I'm angry and scared and disappointed, but I also know that the man I married is still in there somewhere, and that man is worth fighting for. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text. She glanced at it and then looked up at us. Mark wants to know if we're still on for dinner Sunday. Should I tell him yes? The question seemed almost absurd in the context of everything else we'd discussed, but I understood what she was really asking. Were we still a family? Were we going to pretend everything was normal? Or were we going to face this together? Yes, Tom said before I could respond. Tell him yes, and tell him. He paused, clearly struggling. Tell him I owe him an apology and an explanation. He'll understand, Dad. We all will as long as you're honest going forward. That evening, I drove Tom to his first Gamblers Anonymous meeting. The church was a modest brick building, tucked between a dry cleaner and a hardware store, the kind of neighborhood anchor that had probably been serving this community for 50 years. Inside, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across a circle of metal folding chairs in what was probably the Sunday school room during the day. You don't have to come in, Tom said as we sat in the parking lot. I know, but I want to understand what we're dealing with. I'd spent the afternoon reading about gambling addiction online, trying to educate myself about something I'd never imagined would touch our lives. The stories I'd found were frighteningly familiar: the secrecy, the escalating losses, the desperate attempts to win back what had been lost. Inside, about 12 people sat in the circle, ranging from a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25 to a man who looked older than Tom. The group leader, a soft spoken woman named Carol, welcomed us and explained the format of the meeting. We share our experiences, strength, and hope with each other, she said. What's said here stays here. We don't judge, we don't give advice unless it's asked for, and we support each other in recovery. As the meeting progressed, I listened to stories that could have been Tom's: the teacher who'd lost her house, betting on sports; the retiree who'd blown through his pension in 6 months at the slots; the young father who'd lied to his wife about working overtime while he was actually at poker games. When it was Tom's turn to speak, his voice was steady but quiet. I'm Tom, and I'm a gambling addict. I started 8 months ago after I lost my job, and in that time, I've put my family's home at risk and destroyed my wife's trust in me. I'm here because I can't do this alone anymore. The simple admission seemed to physically lighten him, as if he'd been carrying a weight he could finally set down. Around the circle, people nodded, with understanding rather than judgment. After the meeting, several people approached Tom with phone numbers and offers to be sponsors. Carol pulled me aside as well. There are support meetings for family members too, she said gently. Living with addiction affects everyone, not just the addict. I don't know if I'm ready for that yet, I admitted. That's okay, take it one day at a time. But remember, you didn't cause this, you can't control it, and you can't cure it. You can only decide how you're going to take care of yourself. The ride home was quiet, both of us processing what we'd heard and shared. As we pulled into our driveway, Tom reached for my hand. Thank you for coming with me. Thank you for going. It's just the first step, he said. I know that. There's still the money, the house, finding work. One thing at a time, I echoed Carol's words. That night, I lay in bed, listening to Tom's breathing, trying to remember the last time we'd gone to sleep without the weight of secrets between us. The morning seemed to belong to a different lifetime, when my biggest worry had been whether the library would approve my request for more hours during the holiday season. The next day, Sarah returned with Mark in tow, ready to help us meet with the financial counselor she'd found. Janet Rodriguez was a small woman with kind eyes who worked out of an office above the hardware store downtown, helping people navigate financial crises with dignity and realistic planning. Let's start by putting all the numbers on the table, she said, spreading a large pad of paper across her desk. Income, expenses, debts, assets, everything. As we went through our finances line by line, the picture that emerged was grim, but not hopeless. Yes, we were facing foreclosure on the second mortgage. Yes, Tom's job prospects at his age and in this economy were limited. But we also had some equity in the house, a small amount in retirement savings, and Sarah and Mark's support. You have options, Janet said finally. They're not all easy options, but you have choices. The first option was to try to keep the house by finding a way to make the mortgage payments. This would require Tom to find work immediately, and even then, we'd be living paycheck to paycheck with no cushion for emergencies. The second option was to sell the house and use the equity to start fresh somewhere less expensive. We could potentially buy a small condo or rent an apartment, eliminating the mortgage debt entirely. The third option was to let the house go into foreclosure and declare bankruptcy, which would damage our credit, but give us a completely clean slate financially. What would you do? Mark asked. Janet leaned back in her chair. I can't make that decision for you, but I can tell you that the families who recover most successfully from situations like this are the ones who face reality quickly and make changes before they're forced to make them. Over the next week, we scheduled appointments to look at the senior living community Sarah had mentioned, met with a realtor to discuss what our house might be worth in the current market, and researched apartments in nearby towns where rent might be more affordable. The senior living community was a revelation. Sunset Manor wasn't the sterile institution I'd imagined, but a cluster of well maintained buildings surrounded by walking paths and gardens. The one bedroom apartment we toured was small but sunny, with a kitchenette, a living area, and a bedroom just big enough for our bed and dresser. All utilities included, the director, a cheerful woman named Patricia, explained as we walked through the common areas. Meals available if you want them, but not required. Activities every day, book club, quilting, circle, gardening club, movie nights, transportation to shopping and medical appointments. Book club. I perked up despite myself. Every Thursday morning, they're reading the Midnight Library right now. Great group of women, very welcoming to newcomers. I looked around the community room where several residents were playing cards at one table and working on a puzzle at another. It wasn't the life Tom and I had planned, but it didn't look like a prison either. It looked like a place where people were making the best of their circumstances, building new routines and relationships. What about privacy? Tom asked. We're used to our own space. Your apartment is completely private, Patricia assured him. You come and go as you please, have visitors whenever you want. The community activities are optional, not mandatory. Some residents participate in everything others keep to themselves. It's whatever makes you comfortable. The rent was $200 a month, including utilities. Compared to what we were paying in mortgage and utilities at the house, it would save us almost $800 a month. With my library job and Social Security, we could not only afford it, but have some money left over for savings and small luxuries. That evening, as we sat on our back porch, watching the sunset through the maple tree Tom had planted for our 10th anniversary, I tried to imagine leaving this place where we'd built our adult life together. It wouldn't be forever, Tom said, reading my thoughts. If I can get back on my feet, find steady work, maybe we could buy another house in a few years. Would we want to? The question surprised me as much as it probably surprised him. I mean, would we want the responsibility of home ownership again, the maintenance, the yard, work, the property taxes? Tom was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. A year ago, I would have said absolutely. This house, this neighborhood, it represented everything I thought we'd worked for. But now, he gestured at the yard where several small projects sat unfinished. Maybe what we worked for was security and peace of mind, not necessarily a specific building. On Thursday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Sarah's text had shattered our carefully maintained illusions, I made a decision. I dressed in my best blouse and drove to Sunset Manor, where Patricia welcomed me into the Thursday book club with genuine warmth. Ladies, we have a visitor today. This is Donna Davidson. She's thinking about joining our community. 6 women looked up from their copies of The Midnight Library, and I was struck by how alert and engaged they seemed. These weren't the defeated, institutionalized seniors I'd feared, but women who'd clearly found ways to create meaningful lives within their circumstances. Have you read the book? Asked a woman with silver hair and paint-stained fingers. I'm Margaret, by the way. I teach watercolor classes here on Tuesdays. I haven't read it yet, but I've heard wonderful things about it, I replied, settling into an empty chair in their circle. It's about second chances, said another woman, Linda, whose voice reminded me of my favorite teacher from high school. About how it's never too late to reimagine your life. For the next hour, I listened to these women discuss literature with the same passion and insight I'd found in my old book club. They debated character motivation, shared personal experiences that related to the themes, and recommended other books they'd enjoyed. When the meeting ended, several of them invited me to stay for coffee. Huh. How long have you lived here? I asked Margaret as she poured coffee from a pot that had clearly been brewing in someone's apartment. 3 years. My husband died, and I couldn't afford to keep our house on my pension. I thought moving here would be given up accepting defeat. She laughed, a sound full of genuine humor. Turns out it was the beginning of a whole new chapter. I've learned to paint, made friends I never would have met otherwise, and I sleep better knowing that if something happens to me, someone will notice and help. Do you miss your old house? Sometimes. Mostly I miss the garden I spent 20 years creating. But I've got a plot in the community garden here now, and next spring I'm planning to grow tomatoes and peppers again. Life adapts. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months hope, not for a return to our old life, but for the possibility of a different kind of future. One where Tom could focus on recovery without the crushing weight of mortgage payments we couldn't afford, where I could have friends and activities and intellectual stimulation without worrying about whether we could afford the gas money to get there. That evening, Tom came home from his third AA meeting with news. There's a guy in the group, Eddie, who owns a landscaping business. He's looking for someone to help with fall cleanup and snow removal this winter. It's not full time, but it's something. Physical work. I worried about Tom's back, which had bothered him increasingly over the past few years. Mostly supervisory, he needs someone with management experience to coordinate crews and deal with customers. The pay isn't great, but it's honest work, and it's a start. I told him about my visit to Sunset Manor, about the book club, and Margaret's watercolors and Linda's enthusiasm for literature. It's not what we planned, I concluded, but it might be what we need right now. Tom reached for my hand. Are you sure once we sell the house, there's no going back to this life? I looked around our living room at the furniture we'd collected over 3 decades, the photos of Sarah's childhood and our modest vacations, the accumulated possessions of a life lived within careful budgets and reasonable dreams. Some of it would fit in a one-bedroom apartment, most of it wouldn't, but the love and memories that had filled this space weren't tied to these walls. I'm not giving up on us, I said. I'm giving up on the idea that we have to stay stuck in a situation that isn't working just because it's what we've always done. The next morning, I called the realtor. The process of selling a house while facing financial crisis turned out to be both more complicated and more straightforward than I'd expected. Complicated because potential buyers were scarce in our price range and neighborhood. Straightforward because our motivation was clear and our timeline was non-negotiable. You'll probably have to price it below market value to get a quick sale. Our realtor, a patient woman named Carol, explained. But even at a reduced price, you should have enough equity to pay off both mortgages and have some left over for moving expenses and deposits on your new place. While we waited for a buyer, Tom started working for Eddie's landscaping business. The work was seasonal and the pay was modest, but having somewhere to go every morning seemed to restore some of his sense of purpose. He came home tired in a good way, with stories about difficult customers and problem-solving challenges that had nothing to do with casinos or cards or the false promise of easy money. Eddie wants to expand the business next spring, Tom told me one evening as he soaked his sore feet in Epsom salts. He's thinking about adding lawn care services, maybe some basic gardening. He says if I stick with it through the winter, he might make me a partner. A partner? Nothing fancy, but he'd handle the physical labor and I'd handle the business side, scheduling, billing, customer relations. He says I'm good with people, which is more than he can say for himself. Tom grinned, and I realized it was the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen on his face in months. 3 weeks after we listed the house, we got an offer. Not the full asking price, but close enough to make the math work. The buyers were a young couple with a baby, and when they walked through our home during the inspection, I saw them imagining their own life within these walls. The kitchen has good light for morning coffee, the woman said to her husband, standing in exactly the spot where Tom and I had shared thousands of breakfasts together. And that backyard is perfect for a swing set, he replied, looking out the window at the maple tree where Sarah had indeed played as a child. Listening to them plan their future in our house was both heartbreaking and oddly comforting. This place that had sheltered us, that had witnessed our struggles and small triumphs, would continue to be a home for people who needed it. 6 weeks later, we loaded the last of our belongings into Sarah and Mark's truck and took a final walk through the empty rooms. Without furniture and personal belongings, the house looked smaller than I remembered, but also somehow eternal. The afternoon light still fell across the kitchen floor in the same pattern. The loose floorboard in the hallway still creaked under our feet. Some future family would discover these quirks and make them part of their own story. "Ready?" Tom asked, standing in the doorway with the house keys in his hand. I took one last look at the empty living room, remembering Christmas mornings and birthday parties and quiet Sunday afternoons, reading while rain drummed against the windows. Then I walked outside, where our new life was waiting. Our apartment at Sunset Manor was on the second floor, with a view of the community garden. It took us exactly 2 days to unpack everything we'd decided to keep, and another week to figure out where everything belonged in our much smaller space. The adjustment was easier than I'd expected. There was something liberating about owning only what we actually needed and used. Tom attended his AA meetings religiously and threw himself into Eddie's landscaping business with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in years. I joined the book club officially and discovered that Margaret, the watercolor teacher, had been a high school English teacher before she retired. We spent hours discussing literature and sharing stories about challenging students and parents who thought their children's poor grades were the teacher's fault rather than the consequence of not doing homework. Teaching was my first career. I confided to her one afternoon as we worked side by side in the community garden preparing the beds for winter. Before I married Tom, I taught third grade for 2 years. I always thought I'd go back to it someday. Why didn't you? I considered the question as I pulled up the last of the season's tomato plants. Sarah was born, and then Tom's job provided good insurance, and it just seemed easier for me to stay home. Then, when she was older, I felt like I'd been out of the classroom too long to go back. It's never too late, Margaret said, echoing the theme from our first book club discussion. The community college has a program for people who want to return to teaching, and there's always substitute teaching if you want to test the waters. That evening, I mentioned the conversation to Tom as we ate dinner at the small table by our apartment window. Do you think I'm too old to go back to school? Are you kidding? You're the smartest person I know. Besides, you've been helping kids with their homework at the library for years. That's basically teaching. It's different, though. Classroom management lesson plans dealing with parents. So you'd learn those things again. Donna, you've spent the last year figuring out how to navigate my addiction, sell our house, move us into a new life, and keep us both sane in the process. Compared to that, how hard can it be to teach a bunch of 8-year-olds to read? The next day, I drove to the community college and picked up information about their education program. The requirements weren't as daunting as I'd feared, and they offered evening and weekend classes designed for working adults. The financial aid advisor assured me that people in our income bracket qualified for grants that would cover most of the tuition. How long would it take? I asked. 18 months for the certification program, assuming you take 2 classes per semester. Your library science degree covers most of the general education requirements. 18 months. At 57, I'd be 59 when I finished, old enough to collect Social Security in 6 years, but young enough to have a decade or more of teaching ahead of me if I chose. The idea both thrilled and terrified me. Over the next few weeks, as autumn deepened into winter, our new routines solidified. Tom left for work every morning, with Eddie often not returning until after dark. I worked my shifts at the library, attended book club on Thursdays, and spent my evenings reading about education theory and child development. We ate dinner together most nights, sharing stories about our days, like the newlyweds we'd once been, discovering each other again in this smaller, simpler life. The first real test came in December, when Tom's addiction recovery hit what his sponsor called a rough patch. The holiday season triggered memories of past losses at the casino, and the isolation of our new environment made him restless and vulnerable. I keep thinking about that night I won $800, he confided to me after a particularly difficult day. I know it's crazy, but part of me thinks if I could just go back one more time, I could win enough to get us back to where we were. Where we were wasn't working, I reminded him gently. We were drowning in debt and lies. This isn't perfect, but at least it's honest. I know that in my head, but sometimes my head isn't in charge. That night, instead of going to his regular meeting, Tom called his sponsor and attended an extra meeting across town. When he came home, he seemed steadier, more centered. What did you talk about? I asked. About how recovery isn't a destination, it's a daily choice. About how the urge to gamble will probably always be with me, but I can choose what I do with that urge. He sat beside me on our small couch, close enough that I could smell his aftershave and the lingering scent of cold air from outside. I also talked about how grateful I am that you didn't give up on me. I thought about it, I admitted. There were days when I wondered if I'd be better off alone. Well, what stopped you? I considered the question seriously. I think it was realizing that the man I married was still there, just buried under the addiction, and I wanted to see if we could find our way back to each other. Have we? I looked around our small apartment at the life we were building with so much less than we'd had before, but somehow more hope for the future. We're getting there. Christmas that year was different from any we'd celebrated before. Sarah and Mark and the kids came for dinner in our little apartment, crowding around our small table with folding chairs borrowed from the community room. Instead of the elaborate meal I'd traditionally prepared, we ordered Chinese takeout and played board games borrowed from the activity closet downstairs. This is actually more fun than our usual Christmas, my grandson Jake announced as he moved his piece around the Monopoly board. Nobody's stressed about cooking or cleaning up. And Grandpa's not falling asleep in his chair after dinner, added Emma, his younger sister. Tom caught my eye across the table and smiled. Out of the mouths of babes, he said quietly. Later, after Sarah's family had gone home, Tom and I walked through the community room where a group of residents was singing carols around the piano. We didn't know most of the people, but several nodded at us warmly and made room for us to join the circle. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. We sang along with voices that had lived through decades of Christmases, through loss and change, and the quiet miracle of still being here to sing together. When the evening ended, Tom and I walked slowly back to our apartment. The hallway was decorated with garland and twinkling lights, and from behind various doors came the sounds of late-night television, quiet conversations, and the ordinary domestic sounds of people settling in for the night. Nah, I never thought I'd say this, Tom said as we reached our door, but I think this might be the best Christmas we've had in years. Even without the house, without all the decorations and traditions. Especially without all that. This year felt real, like we were celebrating what actually matters instead of trying to live up to some idea of what Christmas is supposed to look like. Inside our apartment, I made tea while Tom switched on the small lamp Margaret had given me for my birthday, a watercolor of the view from our window painted from memory during one of her Thursday classes. In the warm pool of light, our simple living room looked cozy rather than cramped, peaceful rather than diminished. I've been thinking about something, I said as we settled onto the couch with our tea, about going back to school. The teaching program, yes, I've been putting off the decision because it feels like such a big step. But sitting here tonight thinking about how much our lives have changed in 1 year, I realize that big steps aren't necessarily scary anymore. They're just the next thing. Tom reached for my hand. Then let's do it. Both of us starting fresh. You in school, me learning a new business. We're not too old to have new dreams. The next morning, I filled out the application for the community college education program. 6 months later, I was sitting in my first classroom management course surrounded by students young enough to be my children, taking notes on lesson planning and behavior modification techniques. The material came back to me more easily than I'd expected, like a language I'd once been fluent in and was now remembering. Tom's partnership with Eddie became official that spring. They celebrated by getting matching business cards and a new truck with Davidson and Sons Landscaping, painted on the side a name that honored both Tom's contribution and Eddie's family tradition of work in the land. Sons I teased when Tom showed me the cards. Eddie says I'm the son he never had, and he's the father I always needed. Tom replied without embarrassment. Besides, Davidson and Eddie didn't sound very professional. By my second semester in the education program, I was substitute teaching 3 days a week at the elementary school, where I'd once dropped Sarah off for kindergarten. The familiarity of the building, the smell of crayons and cleaning supplies, the sound of children's voices echoing in the hallways, the controlled chaos of recess and lunch periods felt like coming home to a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. Mrs. Davidson, will you be our real teacher someday? A third grader named Maria asked me during story time one afternoon. I hope so. I told her, realizing as I said it that the hope had become certainty. This was what I wanted to do with the next chapter of my life, help children discover the joy of learning the power of their own voices, the endless possibilities that opened up when you could read and write and think critically about the world around you. That evening, I shared Maria's question with Tom as we worked side by side in our section of the community garden. The tomatoes I'd planted were finally beginning to ripen, and the smell of earth and growing things reminded me of the backyard garden I'd left behind at our old house. Do you miss teaching? Tom asked carefully, staking a cucumber vine that was threatening to overwhelm its support. I missed it without realizing I missed it, if that makes sense. Like when you haven't heard a song in years and then it comes on the radio and you remember every word. I know what you mean. I felt that way the first time Eddie let me handle a customer complaint on my own. I'd forgotten how good it feels to solve problems, to make people happy with your work. We worked in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the community building, painting the garden in golden light. Around us, other residents tended their own plots. Margaret working on a flower garden that would provide subjects for her watercolor classes. Linda growing herbs for the cooking club. She'd started an elderly man named Frank, carefully tending the vegetables he shared with neighbors who didn't have gardens of their own. We've built something here, I said, gesturing at the garden, but meaning something larger. Community, Tom agreed. I never really understood what that word meant before. I thought it just meant living near other people, but it's more than that, isn't it? It's caring about each other's success, sharing resources, being part of something bigger than your own individual survival. A year and a half after we'd moved to Sunset Manor, I graduated from the community college education program and accepted my first teaching position in 15 years. The third grade classroom at Riverside Elementary was small and bright, with windows overlooking a playground where children climbed and ran and negotiated the complex social dynamics of 8-year-olds. On my first day, I stood at the front of the room looking at 22 faces full of curiosity, anxiety, excitement, and the particular intensity that children bring to new experiences. Maria, who had inspired my return to teaching, was among them, beaming at me from the front row. Good morning, class. I'm Mrs. Davidson, and I'm so excited to be your teacher this year. A boy in the back row raised his hand. Are you old? The question delivered with the brutal honesty of childhood made me smile. I'm older than your parents, probably, but I'm not too old to learn new things, and I'm definitely not too old to help you learn new things, too. My mom says old people are wise offered a girl with pigtails. Some of us are, I replied, and some of us are still figuring things out. The good news is we can figure them out together. That first year back in the classroom was both exhausting and exhilarating. I had forgotten how much energy children possessed, how many questions they could ask in a single day, how their minds worked in unexpected directions that kept me constantly on my toes. But I had also forgotten the profound satisfaction of watching understanding dawn on a child's face, of seeing a struggling reader suddenly click with a new strategy, of helping young minds develop confidence in their own abilities. Tom's business with Eddie continued to grow. They added 2 part-time employees and expanded their services to include basic home maintenance and minor repairs. Tom's combination of management experience and genuine care for customers made him a natural at the business side of the operation, while Eddie's skill and reliability kept the quality of their work consistently high. We're thinking about bidding on the landscaping contract for the new medical complex, Tom told me one evening as we ate dinner on our small balcony, watching the sunset over the community garden below. It would be our biggest job yet. Are you ready for that? I think so. Eddie says I've got good instincts for what customers want, and I've learned enough about the work to know what's realistic and what's not. He paused fork halfway to his mouth. It's funny how much I enjoy this. I spent 23 years in manufacturing and I was good at it, but I never felt like I was doing anything that mattered. Now I'm helping people make their properties beautiful, creating spaces where families can enjoy being outside together. It feels meaningful. Do you ever regret it? Any of it the gambling? Losing the house, having to start over? Tom considered the question seriously, as he did most things these days. Recovery had taught him to think, before he spoke, to consider his words and their impact, rather than simply reacting to whatever he was feeling in the moment. I regret the pain I caused you and Sarah. I regret the lies and the betrayal of trust. But starting over, he gestured at our small apartment at the community of people who had become our neighbors and friends, at the life we'd built from the ashes of our old one. I don't regret this. We're happier now than we've been in years. We're more honest with each other, more intentional about how we spend our time and money. We have work that matters to us and people who care about our well being. That's not something to regret. As my second year of teaching began, I found myself thinking often about second chances and the courage it takes to rebuild a life from scratch. My students, in their innocence and resilience, reminded me daily that learning never stops, that mistakes are opportunities to try again, that growth happens when you're brave enough to step outside your comfort zone. One afternoon, as I helped Maria sound out a particularly challenging word, she looked up at me with the serious expression children wear when they're grappling with big ideas. Mrs. Davidson, do you think it's scary to get old? Sometimes, I admitted. Getting older means things change, and change can be scary, but it also means you get to have more experiences, learn more things, meet more people. I've learned some of my most important lessons in the last few years. Like what? I thought about how to explain the complexity of adult life to an 8-year-old. Like how it's never too late to start over. Like how being honest, even when it's hard, makes everything better in the long run. Like how the people who love you will stick with you through difficult times if you let them help. That's good, Maria said solemnly, then returned to her reading with renewed focus. That evening, I shared the conversation with Tom as we walked the paths around Sunset Manor. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the trees in the community garden were beginning to show their autumn colors. Other residents nodded and waved as they passed Margaret heading to her evening painting class, Linda returning from her volunteer work at the Literacy Center, Frank carrying a bag of vegetables to share with a neighbor who'd been ill. Do you think we made the right choices? I asked, voicing a question that still occasionally kept me awake at night. I think we made the only choices we could live with, Tom replied. Maybe they weren't the right choices for everyone, but they were right for us. We're still married, we're both doing work, we care about, we have a roof over our heads, and food on the table. Sarah and the kids are proud of us instead of worried about us. That's not nothing. It's not nothing. I agreed, taking his arm as we turned toward home. As we climbed the stairs to our second-floor apartment, I reflected on how the word home had evolved in my understanding. It no longer meant a specific building or address, but rather the place where Tom and I had learned to be honest with each other again, where we'd discovered new dreams to replace the old ones, where we'd built a community of people who knew our story and accepted us anyway.